Today, I want to talk with you a little bit about where is God when bad things happen. I want to start by asking a question, and that is, how many know this guy? How many have heard of this guy before? Billy Graham, huh? The most famous evangelist probably of all times. Now, matter of fact, I might as well mention this. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Foundation is having a crusade in Auckland. How many knew that? November the 19th. They will be at the Trust Arena, and so they're trying to develop interest in that to get, because I know lots of people get saved at these crusades. So just look up the God Loves You Crusade. Anyway, one of the most famous evangelists of all times. Now, there was another guy that could have been even more famous. How many have ever heard of Charles Templeton? Probably not. He used to travel around in the 1940s and early 50s with Billy Graham. He did the European conference and crusades, and he did Sweden and all over the UK. And the National Evangelical Association voted Templeton to be the most versatile evangelist of our time. They had big hopes, high hopes for him. He was to be the big show, more versatile than Billy Graham, etc. Why haven't you heard of him? Well, because this man lost his faith. He began to question God. He began to question, why is there so much evil and pain and suffering around? He wrote a book. His book is called Farewell to God. And in it, one of his excerpts, he says, when an earthquake in Turkey buries thousands alive, when a typhoon drowns 150,000 Pakistanis over a weekend, when a drought in Somalia kills thousands of men, women, and children by starvation, why does a loving God not do something to help these helpless people? You see, the problem of evil and pain and suffering in this world is why many people like Charles Templeton have turned away from the faith. It's why they've left the faith that they've had. It's also why many people have rejected Christianity, why they've not become Christians. There was once a young 13-year-old boy. He had learned of a severe famine in Biafra, Africa. 1968, there was a severe famine. So the 13-year-old, he goes to church and he asks the minister, did God know about this, that this was going to happen beforehand? And the minister said, I know it's hard to understand, son, but yes, God knew about this. And that's all he said. He didn't give him any kind of an explanation, any kind of a defense or an apologetic about why could a loving God do such a thing. This young man vowed, he says, I want nothing to do with this God, and I will never step foot in church again. Maybe you've heard of this 13-year-old. When he became an older man, this is him, Stephen Jobs. What would the Christian world look like if we had Stephen Jobs as an advocate, as a born-again Christian? But see, because of that unanswered question, he says, I don't want anything to do with God or church. He left church. So for generations, evil has been a big problem to answer. Matter of fact, C.S. Lewis said evil is the atheist's most potent weapon against Christianity. And the typical angry atheist rant that you might hear on YouTube goes something like this. A comedian named Stephen Fry, you've probably heard of him. The Archbishop of Canterbury asked him, suppose you get met by God at the pearly gates. Here's what he had to offer.
Suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him or it?
Oh, basically, that is the Odyssey. I think I'll say bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I would say.
So he goes on, do you think you'd get into heaven like that? He said, well, I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want anything to do with a God that's like that. So we do see evil all around us in three different forms. There's moral evil. Those are the evils that men perpetrate against fellow man. There's natural evils, hurricanes, natural disasters, droughts, famines, diseases. Those are natural evils. Then there's social or systemic evils, such as environmental destruction and corporate greed and exploitation and systematic racism. We see this all around us. the atheist might argue, like a prominent atheist named Sam Harris has, that either God can do nothing to stop catastrophes like this, or he doesn't care to, or he doesn't exist. God is either impotent, evil, or imaginary. Take your pick and choose wisely. But what I've given you are kind of what they call a rant, if you will, or an argument just from rant. There's not a true argument. If you want to put forth a formal argument, if you want to write it down, what the atheist is actually saying, formalized, although not stated as such, would be something like this. If God exists, he is, by definition, all-powerful. He's omnipotent. He is all-knowing. That is, he's omniscient. And he's all-loving. That means he's omnibenevolent. No problem so far. 2, and if this kind of God exists, he would not allow evil to occur in the world. Premise 3, evil does occur in this world. Therefore, premise 4, the conclusion is, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God must not exist. He doesn't exist at all. How many have ever heard the term, the devil is in the details? If you find something that the price just seems to be too low, check the fine print, because the devil's in the details. Let's look at the details of this argument a little more fully and see if it really pans out. So, is the form correct? Yeah, the form is good. It's got 3 premises leading to a conclusion, so its form is correct. Then we ask, well, how about the premises? Do we agree with the premises? Well, I agree with premise 1 and premise 3. He's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and we certainly see evil in the world, that's for sure. But does the conclusion then follow that then a God doesn't exist? I would say no. Let me give you what I consider a properly constructed argument regarding the problem of evil and pain and suffering in the world. It would look like this. First premise, the same. If he exists, he's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Secondly, if he exists, he would not allow evil to occur in the world unnecessarily. That's the key, unnecessarily, or without good reason. He's not capricious. Capricious means, off with his head. And his head too. That's capricious. God's not capricious like that. So, and by the way, how much evil would it take to disqualify God? I used to teach science, so I know a bit of science trivia. You know, a bacteria, they usually live for about 12 hours. Would it be evil of God if one died after only about 2 hours? God, how could you? There must not be a God. Or what if you go home and you're about to have lunch and you swat a fly? God allowed that fly to die. Or God forbid you took a can of Raid and sprayed a whole swarm of flies. You know, the whole families of flies. That's too much evil. God can't exist. And I'm kind of joking with these, but I'm making a point. Well, what about if it comes to human? A girlfriend or boyfriend breaks up and someone gets a heartache. Oh, how could a loving God do that? What about a toothache? Anybody ever had a toothache? A little fun there, right? How could God allow this toothache? He must not be there. Or I guess our average life expectancy here in New Zealand is 82.3 years. What if God were so evil as to allow someone to live only 82.2 years? You see, my point is, where do you draw the line? Well, that's just too much evil. God must not exist. It's very arbitrary. And this is why many atheist philosophers, they've abandoned this argument against God. They say it's not defensible. How much evil does it take to disqualify God? Back to the argument then. We see number 3, evil does occur in the world. Therefore, my conclusion, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God may be temporarily allowing evil in this world for his own purposes that we're not aware of and that we can't fully appreciate and understand. And before jumping right into a bunch of answers as to why possibilities, let me give us a word of caution and a reminder. As believers, as humans, we're sometimes tempted to think that God's not doing that good of a job, that we're actually more moral, we're more sympathetic, we're more just than God is. When I was in my either late 20s, early 30s, our pastor of our church, he was a young man, just a little bit older than me. He had 5 children, all under the age of 12. His wife developed cancer. Everybody on the planet, I think, was praying for Shelley. Benny Hinn even laid hands on Shelley. but Shelley died of that cancer. And I thought, I probably didn't vocalize it, but God, how could this be? You missed a perfect opportunity here to show your glory, to heal this pastor's wife. I mean, you missed it here, God. These kids are going to have to grow up without a mom. Pastor Eric is going to have to do all this and lead the church by himself. Boy, I would have certainly done things differently. That never crossed out my lips, but it certainly was in my mind and in my heart. I was imagining that God was a bit unjust. That if I were running things, it would be different, right? But how illogical, how crazy it is for me to think that way. To think that God would create a creature, me, that could be more just, more loving, more fair than God the Creator, right? That somehow the cause is superior, the effect is somehow superior to the cause, superior to the cause. It's not, doesn't make sense. Put another way, the only reason I and you, that we have morality, that we have compassion, that we have, sympathy and a sense of justice is because we were created by a God that is ultimately all of those things. We're created by Him and in His image. The Bible. Some of the Bible authors, they emphasize this. Abraham, regarding God and Sodom, he says, "Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" So when people ask, well, what about people who have never heard of Jesus and the gospel? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? I think the answer is yes, certainly. The only reason we even have any question about that is because the God of all justice has made us in His image. Moses in Deuteronomy, it says, He is the rock. His works are perfect. All of His ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is He. Sometimes we just, like I said, we put God on trial. We try to judge whether He really has good reason for allowing evil to exist. But it's actually impossible because God is omniscient. God knows all things. Our lack of knowledge prevents us from knowing, from ultimately knowing whether an act or something that He allows or disallows is ultimately good or evil. Something which might seem just awesome to us, peachy keen to us, we lack omniscience. We don't know. We don't know how something will turn out. It might end up being actually having negative long-term consequences. For instance, 1955, the World Health Organization decides it's going to try and eradicate malaria. You may or may not know, malaria is a terrible disease that lasts your lifetime, but it's spread by mosquitoes. And so they said, well, if we want to get rid of malaria, which was killing lots of troops in the South Pacific in the 1940s and stuff, and all over the world, let's get rid of the mosquitoes. And so they developed a pesticide. They began to spray this stuff everywhere with tremendous results. They alleviated malaria in North Africa, Europe, Soviet Union, Taiwan, Caribbean, northern region of Australia, large parts of the South Pacific. Also a lot of typhus and dengue, which are also spread by mosquitoes. It was cheap to produce. It was very effective, and it seemed to be household safe. You could buy it down at the local hardware store. But what they didn't realize was that this chemical, diphenyl trichloroethane, also known as DDT, it was an endocrine disruptor. It affects endocrine systems of mammals like us and others and other organisms. And so in the 1972, the World Health Organization, they banned it. No one's allowed to produce it legally or use it legally. All sweet, right? Well, no, it's not all sweet. But they didn't realize this has a half-life. It can last up to 30 years in the soil and up to 150 years in aquatic environments. In other words, it doesn't go away. It bioaccumulates. Little fish eat the algae, which has got the DDT in it. Bigger fish eat the little fish. Bigger fish eat those. And then along comes peregrine falcons and California condors, and they eat these fish. And all of a sudden, they're almost extinct because their eggshells are thinned out. 2005, they did tests on the human populations. Not every single individual who was tested, remember, in 1972, it's banned. No more production of it. 2005, we still all got traces of it in our bodies. And it's a suspected carcinogen and known endocrine disruptor. Who would have thought that way back in the 50s, in the 60s, when they had first invented it, they would have these long-term negative consequences, right? We didn't have the omnipotence. We didn't know these things. We learned as we go. I can sympathize with people that didn't immediately rush to get a COVID vaccination because they realize, some things which seem to be peachy keen and all good might later turn out to be not so good. On the other hand, something that we might perceive as ultimately evil with absolutely no way to justify it could end up being ultimately good. For instance, there was once a man who was heinously tortured and executed by a very brutal, vicious, terrible government regime. The man was not only perfectly innocent, but a model citizen. His friends and family were shocked, they were horrified, they were confused. God, how could you possibly let this happen? He was a teacher in the community. The man was innocent. The man of whom I speak is none other than Jesus Christ. Only now, 2,000 years ago, can we look on that and say, God, that was your brilliance. That was your love to the world. The greatest, ultimate, infinite good for all of eternity to all of mankind. But at the time, they would have missed it. At the time, they wouldn't have seen that. They would have only seen the evil, the shock, and the horror of it. A modern skeptic might look back on this fellow. Maniac! The Holocaust, the extermination of millions, and say, why, God? Why couldn't you just... Lots of kids die of sudden infant death syndrome in their cribs. They just die in their cribs. Why couldn't you have let him die in his crib? But you know what would have happened if he would have died in his cribs? The atheist in 1889, when Hitler was, an infant there, they would have said, how could God have allowed such an innocent little baby to die as a baby? Right? They're not omniscient. They wouldn't have known these things. Only God would have known, right? You say, yeah, God, why didn't you let that happen? Let a few atheists just scoff at it. Or I know, better than that, God, why did you even allow Hitler to be born? Got you there, God. Well, guess what? If God prevented the birth of every evil person, I'm not going to speak for you, but I know there'd be at least one less person in this room. He's standing right here yakking at you right now. You see, God does not grade on a curve. I've never murdered anybody like him. Well, Jesus raised the standard, and he showed you what God's true standard is. He says, if anybody's hated his brother or sister in his heart, he's a murderer. If you've looked at a woman to lust after, if you committed adultery in your heart, God doesn't grade on a curve. He's absolutely just. He is infinitely just. And so, God will not prevent the birth of evil people. Otherwise, no one would be born. No one would ever be born. So, it's pure arrogance to us to try and accuse God of wrongdoing and accuse God because of our limited understanding, our limited knowledge. I mean, think about it as natural parents. How many of you are parents here today? Think about your children when they were like 4. If they could articulate how they felt then, they could have accused you of being an awful parent. I could have been accused of being an awful dad. Think about it. One time, my dad took me to this guy in a white lab coat, and he had this big long needle, and he stuck it in my arm, and it was painful, and my dad just stood right by and let it happen. I'm screaming and yelling, and Dad did nothing. And Dad said something about helping me get sick or something, and so I wouldn't get sick. But I got sick the day after that. Evil, right? Or what about this? One time I ran into an empty street. Dad and I had crossed the street together many times. The street was empty, and Dad gave me the hiding of my lifetime. And it was an empty street, for goodness sake. And Dad had the nerve to say, this is because I love you. And that this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Loving Dad. Last Saturday, Dad took me to the swimming pool. Some stranger he threw me in and just letting me bob and bobble, and I'm choking in the water. And then this stranger just dunked my head under. And I'm screaming out for Dad, and he's right there. I can't understand it. He's sadistic, I think. And yesterday morning, I asked Dad for ice cream with breakfast, and he denied me. Why would he deny me such harmless pleasures in life? I can't understand it. Dad is sadistic. He's capricious. He's a control freak. He's just plain evil. Now, not only in every instance was there a good reason for Dad to act or not to act, but ironically, in every single case I've just talked about, it was done for my good. It was done for the child's good, for his benefit, right? Like Tim Keller points out, he says, just because we don't see a reason for evil and suffering doesn't mean that there's not a reason for it, right? Doesn't mean there's not one. The 4-year-old doesn't have the capacity to understand or comprehend or much less appreciate the reasoning and the wisdom and the love behind all of God's actions. How much less are we? I mean, we think, between the 4-year-old and me is a lot. Yeah, that's true. But between us and an infinitely wise God is an infinite gap of wisdom and an infinite gap of knowledge. And that's where faith has got to come in for us. It really does. God's got an eternal perspective and eternal priorities that we don't. I agree with, there's a French man, he's a Dominican friar, and he says this. He says, if God would give me his omnipotence, in other words, if I were all powerful for 24 hours, I would make a lot of changes in this world. And he goes on wisely. He says, if he gave me his omniscience, his all wisdom too, things would probably not change at all. I can relate to that, right? I can relate to that. God plainly tells us in Isaiah 55, he says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. In other words, my priorities and my perspectives are not like yours. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours. And my thoughts higher than your thoughts. In other words, like the 4-year-olds in comparison to their parents, us in comparison to God's thoughts are as high as the heavens. So if we can't expect to understand everything, much less put God on trial, then how can Stephen Fry, the comedian that you heard the video clip, he assumes, anybody that does that, questions God like that, assumes a place of omniscience, as if they're sitting in God's seat and can see everything and knows everything, and therefore judges God's running of the planet less than what they would have done. And some people might argue that, an omnipotent God, a God that's all-powerful, certainly he could have made a world that was completely free of evil and free of pain and free of suffering. And how would anyone know? Who's ever created a universe and a world? But there's something called design constraint. Apple, they could make your iPhone to where the battery lasted more than a day. They could make it last a month or 6 months. But what would they have to give up to do that? They would have to give up size and weight, right? You could carry, the battery on that iPhone would be the size of a car battery, and it would weigh like a car battery. Yep, see, Apple made a phone whose battery lasted 6 months. That's true, but they would give those things up. God could have made the world completely free of evil, pain, and suffering forever, but what he would have given up was our ability to have free choice. He would have given up our ability to have free choice. That's the trade-off. That's the design constraint there. To say, well, God is omnipotent. He should be able to do anything. Well, that's in other words, he should have been able to make a world that had both free choice and free of evil and pain and suffering. But that's illogical. It's logically impossible that a free moral agent, if I'm free, that I've always got to choose to do and think and say only what is right. Omnipotence is being able to do all actual possible things. In other words, even an omnipotent God cannot make a square circle. It's logically impossible. And so we've got to ask ourselves, which was more loving of a God? To create a world in which love, genuine, true love of choice is possible, but then so is evil? Or make a world where evil and pain and suffering are impossible, but then so is true and free love? He didn't make us robots. So back to the question, second premise then. Why? What are some good reasons? It's true that certainly God allows evil and pain and suffering, but why? Why is there? We've already touched on that a little bit. Sometimes what we see as evil actually has God's great intentions behind it. So a few key thoughts. But before I give you the thoughts, I want to tell you it's not going to completely satisfy you. You're not going to get a high-definition view. It'll be more like what you see behind a frosted glass. You know there's a man back there and a table or something, and you get an outline like that, okay? We see dimly. When we come before Him, He will give us that knowledge. But I'll give you some dim outlines and some ideas here. First of all, it's an emotionally charged problem. The problem of evil and pain and suffering is chocker full of emotion. There's more emotion in it than there is rationale and intellect and thinking. It's hard to think rationally when you are so emotional. Charles Darwin, he didn't lose his faith, the guy that kind of popularized the theory of evolution. He didn't lose his faith because of the science. The science just began to more and more disprove God. No, he lost his faith because his 12-year-old daughter, Anna, actually died despite everyone praying for him. The problem of evil is powerful. It's not rational, but it sure is real. In 2008, I had been in New Zealand for 4 years. That was a year that the wheels fell off on my life in every possible way. So Donna and I had come from the United States to New Zealand to do ministry. We felt like that's what He wanted us to do. We had two young teenagers at the time. We got rid of or sold or gave away all of our belongings, quit our jobs as teachers, and came here to do His work. And 4 years later, everything that could have went wrong. The first thing was we had invested our life savings in a guy down in Wanaka was developing some property at Lake Wanaka, South Island. We thought, yeah, this will be fantastic. We'll do something wise for retirement, because we left our retirement in the States. This guy happened to be a crook, and he didn't take off with our money, but he might as well have. Everything just went wrong, and we lost it completely. Second thing that happened, the ministry we had come to do ministry with, the University Evangelism Ministry, we just began to let's say, not see eye to eye with them. We couldn't, in good conscience, keep doing things the way they were doing things. And we pointed these things out to them. They didn't want to hear it. They just gave us the left foot of fellowship. Said we didn't have the right DNA. I was gutted. If that weren't bad enough, in this same year, 2008, my 17-year-old daughter, the younger of the two up there, decides it'd be a good idea to move out of the house and move in with her boyfriend. We had her in church from day one, homeschooling, public schooling. We invested in those kids. It was devastating to us. God, how could you possibly let this happen? I mean, it wasn't stated as such, but like, God, you kind of owe me here. I mean, I've given up everything for you, and now ministry's gone, money's gone, daughter's gone. And my faith was at an all-time low. It was up for grabs. I'll never forget. I was supposed to be teaching at a Bible school in Samoa, and Don and I were on the beach in Samoa. Just after this had all happened. And she says, Todd, do you still believe in God? And I'm like, yeah. She said, do you still believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? She's making sure I was saved, right? That Jesus Christ is God's Son. And I said, yeah, but that's about all I believe at the moment. My faith was rocked. I couldn't quite leave the faith because I knew too much. I knew that there's no better explanation for the universe and us and a lot of other things other than God. I knew too much about the proof for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that He really proved to be the Son of God. So it was kind of an anchor to keep me drifting away into the sea of atheism. But man, I was at a low that year. That was an emotional hit. Rationally, I kept the faith, but emotionally, I was gutted there. So emotions are real, but not reasonable. The second thing I have to offer you is suffering is not part of God's original created order. When we did the Catechism number 5 there, right? God created everything very good. The way things are now are not at all the way God created them, right? He created them very good, and man rebelled. So if I could reply to Stephen Fry, no, it wasn't God's intention that we have parasites which burrow into the eyes of young people and cause disease there. There's lots of good evidence that many of the pathogenic, the pathogenic viruses and bacteria that cause disease and problems in humans, that many of them were at one time created good. They were harmless to us, but they have mutated. They have changed over time. Things like the diphtheria-causing bacteria and the cholera-causing bacteria. There's lots of evidence that those have mutated, that they were once not pathogenic, harmful to humans. There's other viruses and bacteria that can exist harmlessly in other species, such as the bird flu and the swine flu and the HIV and SIV, the simian immunovirus, and even the COVID virus existed harmlessly in bats. But when it crosses that species barrier, it becomes harmful to us. So everything that's evil today was not evil when God first created it there. Another thought, sometimes the pain we suffer in life is due to foolishness or sins. YouTube is filled with usually young people about Simon's age that are doing silly things on YouTube. Watch me jump off of this roof with no hands or do the skateboard trick. And we can't blame God on that. People that smoke, like my grandfather did all of his life. He died of emphysema. We couldn't blame that on God, right? People who drink all their lives and die of cirrhosis of the liver, we can't lay those on God's feet. So sometimes that can be explained. Sometimes it's not humans' fault. Like I said, we're living in a broken, fallen world. And so that there's floods and droughts and earthquakes and famines and typhoons was not the way God made it. We're living in a broken world and paying the consequences. The very outrage of the typhoons that kill 100,000 people, the very outrage tells us something's not right. At least it tells us Christians that. We intuitively know this is not the way things should be. But the atheist cannot go there. If we are just, a bunch of random collisions that have the product of chance and time and stuff, then anything that happens just happens. You can't say that's not right. It just is. But something intuitively tells mankind that this is not the way things should be. And they're right. It's not the way things should be. Sometimes we suffer. The suffering is due to the sins and the evil intents of other people. We can be victims of other people's greed and lust and cruelty, like what Hitler inflicted. And again, if God were obligated to stop any act of evil, then he would be obligated to stop every act of evil. Not only could I not steal this nice little microphone here, I couldn't even think about stealing it. And we're back to no free choice. We're back to a world of robots where we can't love. One good, I'm going to start getting positive, one good that can come from evil and pain and suffering, and especially true for believers, but not exclusively, is some lessons are only learned. Some lessons are only learned when there's suffering, when there's pain. Excuse me, I look back on 2008. That year that was so difficult for me. And I look back on that only now and I can see a little bit of what God was doing. Not all of it. God hasn't pulled back the curtains all the way. It's still frosted glass, but I see some things. I had a simplistic theology. I had an inaccurate theology. For instance, I had a theology that said A plus B equals C. If I give up my job, if I move to New Zealand, if I start reaching people and being a good little boy, then God's got to bless me in every possible way. Take care of my finances, help me take care of my family, etc. God is sovereign. God is sovereign in life. There's no promises that A plus B equals C. When you look at Adam and Eve, God's first children, they rebelled against him. And he was the perfect heavenly father in the perfect environment there in the garden. I'm sorry. I know it's terrible. Is there a mute button if I need to cough? I have a lot of sympathy when people tell me that they're going through it with their young teenage boys and daughters, sons and daughters like that. Before, I wouldn't have had any empathy. I would have thought, you're just not doing it right. A plus B equals C. Look at this. Let me show you how to do this right. I would have had no sympathy at all. I had no sympathy for people who are really suffering, thinking. I had a very transactional idea of God. If I do this, God, you're obligated to do that. I've grown out of that. There's some Christian streams of theology that would have us deceived into thinking that God's number one priority for you in this life is your comfort and your ease. One popular American preacher wrote a book called Your Best Life Now, as if that was God's number one priority, was to have your best life now, the life that you can imagine. To people in that stream of thinking and theology, discomfort proves that there's a lack of faith in you, right? That's why many people have abandoned the faith or feel like God's abandoned them because they've had a wrong theology. Is it true that we as earthly fathers have as a number one priority for our children their comfort? No, I don't think so. We prioritize their character development. How many of you were rightly told as children, a little bit of blank, fill in the blank, is not going to kill you? A little bit of hard work is not going to kill you. Anyone heard that one? A little bit of pain is not going to kill them. A little bit of waiting is not going to kill them. A little bit of hunger is not going to kill them. We realize that. You know, when we got little grandchildren at the house and they scream and stuff, and as long as they're fed and have their diaper changed, Don and I believe, we come to realize a little bit of screaming is not going to kill them. They're not going to train us to operate on their schedule. We're building something in them, a trust that everything is okay. God's desire is for us to be conformed to His Son, that we begin to look more and more like Jesus, and sometimes suffering is the way to do that. C.S. Lewis, he says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but He shouts to us in our pains. That's true. God plainly tells us that in Scripture. In 1 Peter, he says, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes, even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Notice it says all kinds of trials. It's not just when you're persecuted for the gospel's sake in the Sudan. No, it's when you have a flat tire on your car, when the battery runs out, when you spill coffee on yourself as you're getting ready to go to church. All kinds of trials are working in you something that a trouble-free life would not work in you. And God knows that. Another good which can come from evil, pain, and suffering is this one. The pain and heartache of this world can make us long for another world. It's certainly possible that God uses the natural and moral evils of this world to increase our longing for Him and His kingdom. Before COVID, they used to give away salty peanuts and salty chips in bars. You know why they did that? It was to make you thirsty. It made you want to drink their expensive beverages there. And in the same way, God can use the evils and woes of this world to want us long for a better, to want us to long for something that's more fulfilling and substantial. Sometimes on our backs is the only position we are when we're looking to God and trusting in God. The greatest good which can possibly come from evil and pain and suffering is that it causes people to seek out a relationship with God. Seek after God. God's ultimate goal is not our happiness or comfort, but an increasing knowledge of Him, which alone can bring eternal happiness to us. And it's kind of ironic that the areas where the Christian church is growing the fastest on this planet are the places where there's the greatest degree of persecution and suffering. In the Sudan, in Ethiopia, in the Philippines, in China, El Salvador, just places where the church is greatly persecuted. In the Middle East, it's growing. Why? Because of all that suffering, they're yearning and longing for something better, some deliverance, eternal deliverance. So, if there's even one good reason or necessary reason why God allows natural evil to exist, and I've given several possible reasons, then we can't claim that it prohibits God, that it excludes God, right? If there's just one reason, then we can't say, therefore there's no God because of evil. And while it's true that us as believers, we do have to account. We have to have an explanation to people that ask us, like 2 Peter 3:18 says, be able to give a defense, be ready to give a defense for the hope, the reason for the hope that's within you. We do have to answer for evil, but like the Rabbi Milton Steinberg said, he said the believer does have to account for unjust suffering, but the atheist has to account for the existence of everything else. Everything else. In other words, they have to account how we have love and altruism on this planet. They have to account why there's music and poetry in the universe at all, why there's intelligence out there, why there's information, why there's self-sacrifice. Atheism is completely powerless to explain these things. There's a lot to explain there, whereas we, on our lap, we do have to explain or try to explain why God could possibly allow evil on the planet. A few more crucial points to ponder and I close. It's absolutely crucial to remember this. The grave is not the end of the story. Life does not end at the grave. If this life was all we had, if we could question God's fairness, God's goodness, God's motives, God's methods, but we're promised that this life is not. The eternal God from heaven sees with an eternal perspective, right? And it's impossible for us to do. It's easy for us to forget. If today was all we had and I denied my 4-year-old ice cream, I would be evil and capricious. It would be downright evil. But we know that kid's going to grow up, and he better grow up with some teeth, and he needs some nutrition in his life, right? We have a bit of a different perspective there. And so the God of eternity, he has all eternity to bring justice. There's a day of reckoning. So our conclusion number 4, he may be temporarily allowing evil, but just temporarily. It's not going to go on forever. He promises that. Now, on the brighter side, if you feel like maybe you've been robbed in this life, you've suffered terribly, you've suffered needlessly, you've had a Job experience of a life, God has all eternity to, quote unquote, make it up to you. To bring an understanding like the 4-year-old. Maybe it'll be all of a sudden when you see Jesus, maybe it'll be like a plot twist. You've watched a movie and you've seen the evil villain, bad guy, the whole movie, and then at the very last 2 minutes, they twist that on you. He's actually been the hero in disguise. He's actually been the one that's prevented evil. He's actually been self-sacrificial. Whoa, just in a moment, you think, wow, what a hero instead of what a villain. Maybe that God will give us that kind of a revelation about him. Oh, God, I see your wonderful plan. All of your ways are right. All of your ways are just. Mother Teresa, who dealt with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of misery on a daily basis, right? She had this to offer those who suffered. She says, in light of heaven, let me elaborate because it goes on. In other words, when we've been there 10,000 years in the presence of infinite love and infinite joy and infinite peace and infinite justice, eternal justice, a place without any sorrow, any tears, any pain, any suffering. When we've been there in light of eternity, she says, the worst suffering on earth, a life full of the most atrocious tortures on earth, will be seen as no more heinous than one night in an inconvenient hotel. You look back on it and say, that was a bad night in a bad hotel. We'll look on it like that. And I think she's right. Our last point to ponder is and it absolutely distinguishes us as Christians from all other religions, and that God is not distant from suffering. He's not removed from suffering. He's not immune to suffering. But God is intimately involved with our suffering. He suffers with us, right? God is involved with our suffering. I don't know what happened to my last slide, but there we go. Jesus will forever bear the scars on his hands and his feet as the one that suffered on our behalf. Jesus doesn't just know about suffering, right? He suffered himself. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with griefs, emotional suffering he knows, physical suffering. The Bible says he was marred. You couldn't even recognize him. He was beat up so badly. He suffered in all the ways we could possibly suffer, but to a greater degree because he was a perfectly innocent man. He knows what we feel. He understands. Shortest verse in the Bible. We always have a contest. Who knows a Bible verse? And the boys always try and get up and do, Jesus wept. But Jesus did weep because he knows what it feels like to have emotional pain. He was sympathetic. And I agree with John Stott, the theologian. He says, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross of Christ. So, evangelistically, in other words, you're a Christian, you meet somebody that's not, but they've gone through a lot of suffering. A few things to note. Just be compassionate. First and foremost, be compassionate. Weep with those that weep. Weep with those that weep. Be sympathetic. Be understanding. Put yourself in their shoes. Think about the most painful experience you have and think that's where they're going through right now. Listen to them and wait for a response. Wait for a response. Don't open up your notes from today's sermon. Well, Pastor Todd says A, B, and C, D. Doesn't this help you? Sometimes that's counterproductive. Sometimes people just want you to feel what they feel. They want you to know that you really understand the depth of their sorrow. And so wait on the timing of the Holy Spirit to give them any potential answers or reasons. What about us when we're Christians and we're going through a terrible time like Job did in the Bible? Well, ask yourself a couple questions. One is this suffering from my own sin or my own foolishness? Don't be too tough on yourself. If you kicked the dog or swore at the cat yesterday, God's not going to strike you down with cancer, okay? You might want to talk to Pastor Ian about it. You think God could be teaching me something? I don't know. What have you done? Well, I swore at the dog. No, God's not teaching you something in that, okay? But sometimes when we are flagrantly in rebellion and disobedience to God, sometimes God gets our attention, puts us on our back. And ask God, God, what are you saying to me through this? Like my 2008 experience. It took some time for me to get a little bit of perspective on it. Maybe you'll get some perspective on it in time. God, what do you want me to do in this? And hold on to your hope, because remember, God sometimes vindicates in this lifetime. I'm doing Bible in school right now, and I'm taking them through the story of Joseph. What a story of God vindicating. Man, he was thrown in prison by his brothers and lied on by Potiphar's wife. God sometimes vindicates in this lifetime, but he ultimately, infinitely vindicates eternally. Justice may not be served in this life, but it will be served. And then ask yourself this one last question. Where else would I go? If you've experienced, if you've tasted and seen that the Lord is good, and you've tasted of his goodness, and you've tasted of his grace, and the relationship with him, ask yourself, where else would I go? Who, what would I turn to? I started with a story about Charles Templeton. Let me finish with Charles Templeton, making sure he's up there, with the same story, continuing on. So, he writes a book in 1996, I think, Why He Left His Faith, right? Shortly after that, Lee Strobel wrote a book called Case for Faith. He's a Christian man, and he writes about Christian things. And Lee Strobel had an opportunity to interview Charles Templeton after he'd lost his faith. Now, Templeton was by now in his 80s. It had been like 50 years since he had left Christianity. He's in his 80s. He's suffering from Alzheimer's, but he still had enough to be with it in the interview. And Strobel asked him, how do you assess Jesus? What do you think about Jesus? A few things. He said, Jesus is the greatest human being who's ever lived. He is the most important thing in my life. Templeton, the atheist, says this. I adore him. Everything good I know, everything decent I know, everything pure I know, I learned from Jesus. In my view, he's the most important human being who ever existed. And if I put it this way, and it says tears were flooding down Templeton's eyes. If I put it this way, I miss him. I miss him. What a sad story about a guy who just couldn't wrestle with a world that had evil in it. And he leaves this Jesus who he misses the entire rest of his life. Where else would we go? Close your eyes. I want to pray. I'll close up in prayer. Jesus, I pray for my brothers and my sisters and myself that when we experience evil and pain and suffering in this world, that you'd help us to keep our eyes fixed on the next world, on that which is eternal, not that which is temporary. And God, when we suffer and experience evil and pain in life, help us to sustain our faith. Help sustain our trust in you. Our trust that the all-wise, all-loving God is behind the scenes, working everything out for our good and your own glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. It's all yours.
Thanks for that message. Before we wrap up the service, if you feel free to fill